The room was cold. The admirals looked at the diagram, then at each other. They had asked for a ghost. They had been given a phantom that was slowly, inexorably threatening to materialize in the worst possible way. The dream of an invisible, persistent carrier was colliding with the immutable laws of physics and risk. A decision was looming, not about tactics or strategy, but about survival, both of the ship and of the secret it embodied. The decision was not marked by a ceremony, but by a silent, surgical excision. The Azure platform had become, in the parlance of its masters, a toxic asset. Its strategic value was incalculable, but its operational risk was now deemed catastrophic. The haunting warning from the chief engineer, one malfunction away from a national incident, had crystallized into a directive from the highest levels of the National Security Council. The ship could not be allowed to sail. It could not even be allowed to exist in a recognizable form. The operation was codenamed Scythe. On a moonless night in late 1964, under a strict communications blackout, the ghost carrier received its final orders. It was to proceed, under its own failing but sufficient power, to a location known only as Site X-ray. The coordinates led to a place that did not appear on any maritime chart, a hidden dry dock complex carved into the side of a remote fjord in the Aleutian Islands. This was not a naval station. It was a crypt. The journey was its last secret patrol. Escorted by a single, equally unmarked tug whose crew had no knowledge of the vessel's identity, the Azure platform slipped through the North Pacific fog like a dying sea creature returning to its birth trench. It entered the fjord, where massive camouflage doors built into the rock face slid open, swallowing the ship whole. Inside, under the glare of arc lights powered by generators whose rumble was absorbed by the surrounding mountains, the final act began. The work crews were not sailors. They were a hand-picked consortium of technicians from the original defense contractors, sworn to a new, even deeper layer of secrecy. Their task was not repair, but dissolution. They worked with the cold efficiency of pathologists performing an autopsy meant to obscure the cause of death. First, the classified components were removed. The entire Hydra propulsion core, drained of its volatile coolant and cut free with torches that cast eerie blue shadows on the cavern walls. The advanced radar-absorbent composite panels were painstakingly pried from the hull, their unique chemical composition too sensitive to leave intact. The specialized launch and recovery systems for its aircraft were unbolted and crated. Then, the dismemberment. Cutting torches, their sparks cascading into the dark water of the dry dock, slit through the flight deck at pre-marked lines. Entire sections, the distinctive angled island, the truncated bow were lifted away by enormous silent gantry cranes. The goal was not to preserve, but to obliterate the ship's identity. Within months, the sleek, menacing silhouette was gone. What remained in the basin was a gutted, anonymous hull, a steel skeleton that bore no resemblance to its former self. The bureaucracy of erasure moved in lockstep. In the vaults of the Naval Vessel Register, any cryptic entries related to Project Azure were permanently deleted. The crew rotation schedule ceased. The budget line for advanced naval engineering research was formally closed, its remaining funds dispersed into a dozen other black projects. The sailors who had manned the ship were reassigned with new, fabricated service records. A few key officers were given early, comfortable retirements, with the unspoken understanding that their silence was a lifelong duty. The final twist was one of macabre practicality. The steel of the Azure platform was not wasted. It was too high grade, too specialized to simply scrap. In reports, it was listed as surplus experimental hull plating. This material, along with components from its power plant and sensors, was quietly fed back into the Pentagon's secret research pipeline. Pieces of the ghost ship would later be identified, though never sourced, in materials tests for the Sea Shadow stealth ship in the 1980s and in early studies for what would become the Zumwalt-class destroyers. The vessel was cannibalized to feed future ghosts. The official line, delivered only if some persistent auditor or historian ever stumbled upon a stray reference, was a model of bland denial.
No vessel matching that description ever entered service with the United States Navy. Any such references are likely conflated with conceptual design studies that were never approved for construction. The ship had been unmade, its physical form and its paper trail dissolved in acid and fire. It had vanished from the fleet not with a decommissioning ceremony, but with the silence of a file being dropped into a shredder. For decades, the Azure platform existed only in rumor and the fragmented memories of aging men. Then, in 2004, a bureaucratic error pierced the veil. A military historian filed a broad Freedom of Information Act request for all declassified schematics related to post-war naval aviation concept studies, 1955 to 1970. The request was processed by an overworked archivist at the National Archives Annex in College Park, Maryland. Among thousands of pages of legitimate declassified material, early sketches for what became the F-14 Tomcat, deck layouts for the Nimitz class, one single document slipped through. It was a single large-format blueprint folded and misfiled decades prior. The document bore no classification stamps, no project name, no distribution list. It was a clean, technical drawing, but to the trained eye, it was a thunderbolt. The blueprint depicted a vessel profile and deck plan. It was unmistakably a flat top, an aircraft carrier, yet it was all wrong. Its length was scaled at roughly 750 feet, larger than any destroyer or cruiser of the era, but a full 300 feet shorter than the contemporary Kitty Hawk. Its island was a minimal angled wedge. The flight deck was a truncated trapezoid, with two elevators positioned in a bizarre forward diagonal arrangement that defied all conventional carrier design logic. Most tellingly, the legend on the drawing noted specifications for composite hull sheathing and listed a power plant designation, Hydra-1A. The technology described didn't just predate its public emergence, it predicted it. Composite hull sheathing for radar absorption wouldn't be openly discussed until the Sea Shadow trials in the 1980s. The hull form itself, with its knife-like bow and tumble-home sides, bore a shocking resemblance to the Zumwalt-class destroyer, a ship whose design wouldn't be finalized for another 40 years. Here, in crisp 1960s-era drawing lines, was the Ghost. The discovery sent a minor shockwave through a small community of naval historians and black project researchers. The blueprint was authentic. The paper stock, the ink, the drafting style, all were period correct. It was the smoking gun, yet one that confirmed a crime no official entity would ever acknowledge. The vessel on the paper was the Azure platform, captured in a moment of conceptual purity, before it was built and before it was erased. This single piece of evidence reshaped the historical consensus. The leading theory now holds that the secret carrier wasn't ultimately canceled because it was a failure. In many ways, it was a terrifying success. It had penetrated Soviet defenses. It had gathered priceless intelligence. It had proven that a stealthy, persistent carrier was possible. And that was precisely the problem. A ship that could go anywhere, into the heart of a Soviet naval exercise, along the edge of the Arctic ice pack, within missile range of Vladivostok without being seen, was the ultimate first strike weapon. It destabilized in the purest sense of Cold War doctrine. It threatened to upend the delicate, horrible balance of mutual assured destruction by offering one side a shield of invisibility and a dagger of undeniable surprise. Its very existence invited preemptive panic, the kind of panic that could start a war out of fear of the unknown. The Hydra system's instability was not the cause of its retirement. It was the convenient engineering justification for a political and strategic necessity. America had built a monster it could not control, a weapon so potent it threatened the very logic of the stalemate that kept the world from nuclear war. And so, the only rational choice was to kill it, not with a missile or a torpedo, but with bureaucracy, torches, and silence. America had looked into the future of naval warfare, seen a path to absolute dominance, and recoiled from the precipice. They buried their creation, not in the deep ocean, but in the deeper darkness of denied history. They pretended it never existed, because admitting the truth would have been to confess that for a brief, shadowy moment, they had built a machine that could win a war by its presence alone, and in doing so, might have compelled the other side to start one. The Azure platform's legacy is not of rust or ruin, but of a chilling lesson. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one you dare not use, and the most dangerous secret is the one you successfully convince the world is just a dream.
The Barents Sea in the autumn of 1962 was a theater of controlled fury. The Soviet Northern Fleet, the mailed fist of the Kremlin's naval power, was conducting Operation Polyarny Shit, Polar Shield. It was the largest live-fire exercise the Soviets had ever attempted in northern waters, a sprawling ballet of destruction designed to simulate the opening hours of a NATO war. Dozens of surface combatants cut through the freezing gray water, while below, the sinister shadows of November-class submarines conducted mock attack runs. The air crackled with radio traffic in dense encrypted Russian, and the horizon was periodically lit by the flash of naval artillery and the distant, fiery blossoms of anti-aircraft missiles. In a heavily fortified command bunker on the Kola Peninsula, Fleet Admiral Vladimir Kasatonov monitored the exercise with grim satisfaction. His radars painted a picture of complete dominance. The sky and sea were his. Then, at 14:33 local time, a junior operator at a coastal radar station near Murmansk spoke up, his voice tight with confusion. "Contact. Bearing 275, range 180 kilometers, low altitude, speed high, very high." The blip was anomalous. It wasn't following the established commercial air corridors. It wasn't one of the exercise's own aircraft, all of which were meticulously tracked. This was something new, and it was moving with a purpose that set off every alarm in Kasatonov's strategic mind. The track originated not from the direction of Norway or the open Atlantic, but from a point deep in the Barents Sea itself, hundreds of kilometers from any conceivable friendly airfield. As they watched, the contact gained altitude rapidly and began a slow, looping turn, a clear reconnaissance pattern. A Tu-95RT Bear D maritime patrol aircraft was vectored to intercept. The Bear's powerful radar swept the sector and found nothing. The crew reported only empty, choppy sea below, yet the ground-based radars, newer and more powerful, held the fleeting contact for a few more minutes before it vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Kasatonov was a veteran. He knew the signatures of American aircraft. This was not a U-2, too fast and too low. It was not an A-3 Sky Warrior. No American carrier was within 1,000 miles. The nearest U.S. naval force was the USS Enterprise battle group, deliberately positioned far to the south near Scotland, a visible and reassuring distance away, as part of the delicate diplomatic dance following the Cuban Missile Crisis just weeks prior. This left only one impossible, terrifying conclusion. The aircraft had launched from the sea, inside his exercise area. The implications were seismic. If the Americans could place an air-capable platform, a carrier this deep into his defended waters without a single sonar contact, a single radar warning, then the entire Soviet maritime strategy was built on sand. Their bastion defense of the Arctic, the sanctity of their ballistic missile submarine hiding grounds, was a fiction. A storm of encrypted cables blew into Moscow. The KGB's scientific directorate was ordered to analyze the radar data. Their report, stamped Совершенно секретно, top secret, was unequivocal. The radar return was real. The aircraft's performance profile matched known American reconnaissance types, and its point of origin suggested a mobile, stealthy platform of significant size. The Soviets had a name for such a theoretical threat: Priyatel Prizok, friend ghost. They now believed it was not theoretical. Diplomatic channels hissed with quiet, furious inquiries. Through back channels in Geneva and at the United Nations, Soviet diplomats presented their concerns about provocative and destabilizing incursions. The evidence, cleaned of its most classified details, was hinted at. The American response was a masterpiece of gaslighting on a geopolitical scale. The Pentagon, through the State Department, issued a series of bland, dismissive statements. The incident was attributed to an anomalous atmospheric propagation, a temperature inversion that could bend radar waves and create false echoes over the horizon. They suggested a malfunctioning Soviet tracking system, perhaps still stressed from the high alert of the recent crisis. In private briefings to select allies, U.S. officials would shrug and offer a condescending smile. The Soviets are seeing ghosts. Their own paranoia is their worst enemy. The strategy was audacious. Use the very incredibility of the Azure platform's existence as its primary cloak. The Soviets were right, and because they were so spectacularly right, no one would believe them. The truth was dismissed as the paranoid fantasy of a rattled adversary. While diplomats traded fictions, the reality aboard the Azure platform was a slow-burning nightmare of engineering anxiety. The ship's crown jewel, its revolutionary propulsion system, was revealing itself to be a capricious and dangerous genie. Dubbed the Hydra system by the few engineers who understood it, it was a closed-cycle, low-thermal emission plant that used a complex cocktail of liquid metals and advanced ceramics in its heat exchange process. In theory, it was brilliant. It generated sufficient power for the ship's needs, while radiating less than 1/10 the infrared signature of a conventional reactor, and producing a sonic profile closer to a thermal vent on the ocean floor than a man-made vessel. In practice, it was a temperamental beast. The system operated at the very edge of material science. The primary liquid metal coolant, a eutectic blend of sodium and potassium, was a nightmare to contain. It reacted violently with seawater and burned in air. The ceramic-lined conduits, designed to withstand tremendous heat, were prone to developing microfissures under thermal cycling. The worst flaw, however, was a phenomenon the engineers called thermal runaway. Due to a quirk in the neutron moderation design, under certain load conditions, like a sudden demand for high speed to evade a potential threat, the reaction could spike unpredictably. Sensors would show a sudden, jagged climb in core temperature, not a smooth curve. The consequences were written in series of terrified classified engineering reports that never left the program. Event 17 Alpha, portside heat exchanger manifold suffered catastrophic failure. Hull plating in sector G7 exhibited warping of 12 centimeters. Temperature at epicenter reached 1200 degrees Celsius, compromising structural integrity. The ship had developed a hotspot, a blister on its stealthy skin that would have glowed like a lighthouse to an IR satellite. On another occasion, Event 22 Charlie, electrical surge from primary Hydra regulator fried 3 decks of avionics and control systems for aircraft launch. The ship was blind and unable to recover aircraft for 48 hours during corrective procedures. Each event was a desperate all-hands struggle in the bowels of the ship. Crews in specialized asbestos and ceramic suits would fight to isolate sections, inject stabilizing inhibitors, and manually vent superheated steam through emergency ports that itself risked creating a visible plume. The psychological toll on the engineering crew was immense. They lived with the knowledge that their life's work, the machine that kept them invisible, was also a potential funeral pyre. The central tragic paradox was now clear. The Hydra system was the source of the ship's invisibility, but it was also the greatest threat to its exposure. Shutting it down completely for a full overhaul was unthinkable. Without its unique low-signature power, the ship would just be a slow, conventionally powered hull, its radar-absorbent skin useless without the silent propulsion to match. It would be detectable, and to be detected was to fail its entire reason for being. Yet keeping it operational was to sail with a lit fuse. The final grim assessment was delivered in a secure briefing room at the Pentagon in early 1964. The lead systems engineer for Project Azure, a man who had aged a decade and 3 years, stood before a panel of stone-faced admirals and civilian overseers. His report was technical, but his conclusion was starkly human. He placed a single slide on the projector. It was a simplified diagram of the Hydra system with a large red X overlaid. "Sirs," he said, his voice hollow with fatigue and fear, "the system is not just unreliable, it is metastable. We are managing its symptoms, not curing its disease. It has multiple single-point failure modes that could lead to a cascading event.
We are one unexpected power fluctuation, one material fatigue failure, one software glitch away from a thermal event we cannot contain. He paused, letting the gravity sink into the silent room. We are one malfunction away from turning a national asset into a national incident, a radioactive, visible, and incontrovertible incident in the middle of the Barents Sea or the Greenland Gap. The Soviets wouldn't need to find us. We would light ourselves up for them.
The story begins not with the roar of engines or the slap of waves against steel, but with the whisper of paper in a silent archive. In the late 1990s, a historian poring over a newly declassified batch of Department of Defense correspondence from 1963 stumbled upon a single, bewildering paragraph. It was a memo from the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations to the Secretary of Defense concerning fleet readiness in non-permissive environments. Buried in the bureaucratic jargon was a reference to the asset designated for Project Azure. The memo requested additional funding for ongoing maintenance and crew rotation for the Azure platform, currently operating in a state of compartmentalized readiness. The historian, a former naval officer himself, felt a familiar chill. Compartmentalized readiness was a term of art, a black vault within the already secretive world of classified projects. It didn't just mean secret, it meant unacknowledged. It meant an asset so sensitive that its very existence was a state secret, known only to a handful of individuals cleared into a special access program beyond top secret. Intrigued, he began a cross-reference. He checked the Naval Vessel Register, the Bible of every commissioned ship in the U.S. Navy. No Azure. He searched shipyard records, keel-laying reports, commissioning ceremonies. Nothing. He looked for hull numbers, CV, CVA, CVN, anything that could denote an aircraft carrier. The trail was cold. It was as if the memo was discussing a ghost. But the historian knew the language of the Pentagon. Words like platform, operational status, and crew rotation were not used for theoretical concepts or paper studies. They were used for physical, steel-hulled reality. This was a vessel, a specific, singular vessel. It had no name in any public ledger. It had no hull number painted on its bow or etched into Navy databases. It had no launch date celebrated with champagne, no commissioning crew photographed on its pristine deck. Its crew list existed, if it existed at all, on a sheet of paper in a safe that required 2 keys to open, held by 2 different men who would never meet. The memo's lone, telling line, operational status, compartmentalized, was the only epitaph it would ever receive. It was a sentence that confessed everything and nothing. It confirmed the vessel lived, breathed, and sailed, and it confirmed that the entire sprawling apparatus of the United States government was contractually, legally, and lethally obligated to pretend it did not. To understand why such a ship would be born into shadows, one must breathe the air of the early 1960s. The Cold War was not cold. It was a white-hot forge of paranoia. The Cuban Missile Crisis had just brought the world to the brink. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction was calcifying into a grim gospel. In the war rooms of the Pentagon, a terrifying question dominated every strategy session. What happens after the first strike? If Soviet SSBNs and ICBMs rained down on Pearl Harbor, Norfolk, and San Diego, what would be left to retaliate? The visible fleet, the mighty Forrestal-class supercarriers, the lines of battleships, were magnificent, but they were also bullseyes. They were the first targets. National survival demanded a second strike capability at sea, a weapon that could slither unseen through the ocean's veins, survive the apocalyptic opening salvo, and then rise from the depths to unleash hell. This was the strategic cradle that birthed the Azure platform. It was not to be a symbol of power projection, but a specter of guaranteed vengeance. Engineers and naval architects, working from secluded design bureaus with windows painted black, were given a seemingly impossible brief: create an aircraft carrier that could disappear. The result was a machine of radical compromise and breathtaking innovation. It was smaller than a Kitty Hawk-class supercarrier, perhaps 2/3 the size, with a drastically reduced silhouette. Its flight deck was not the familiar elongated rectangle, but a truncated, trapezoidal-shaped, optimized for launching a specific, limited complement of aircraft, not vast fighter wings, but a handful of critical long-range reconnaissance and strike planes.
Its island superstructure was low, squat, and angled, a slab of radar-absorbent material rather than a towering castle of antennas. From a distance, it would not present the distinctive, glorious profile of a carrier. It would register as a large, ambiguous merchant vessel, or better yet, a minor blip that faded into the sea clutter. Its advancements were its reason for being. Magnetic wake suppression was a black art born from submarine technology. Through a system of charged plates and trailing conduits along its hull, the ship could theoretically disrupt the ionic signature left by its passage, blurring the telltale trail that specialized Soviet satellites and sniffers were beginning to track. Its reduced radar profile was not just by shape, but by skin. Its hull was sheathed in a proprietary composite, a layered, rubberized, non-ferrous material designed to absorb radar waves rather than reflect them, making it a dark smudge on a Soviet radar screen, easily dismissed as an atmospheric anomaly or a school of whales. But the heart of its invisibility was its experimental propulsion. It forwent the standard, powerful, but thermodynamically bright nuclear reactors of the Enterprise. Instead, it employed a closed-cycle, low-emission power plant, possibly a derivative of the turbo-electric systems studied for ultra-quiet submarines. It was slower than a conventional carrier, incapable of the 30-plus knot sprints of its fleet counterparts, but in return, its acoustic and infrared signature was whisper-quiet. To enemy hydrophone arrays, it would sound like a distant, benign seismic rumble. To infrared satellites, its heat plume would be diffuse, lost in the ambient temperature of the ocean. It was, on paper, everything the Navy's most forward-thinking admirals dreamed of: a survivor, a ghost, a persistent denying presence in a post-strike world. And it was everything the Navy's institutional mind feared: a profound departure from tradition, a monstrously expensive secret that Congress could not scrutinize, a weapon whose very success depended on it never being seen, never being tested in combat, and never being acknowledged. They had built a masterpiece of clandestine naval engineering, and in doing so, had created a permanent, floating crisis of conscience. The men who crewed the Azure platform were not simply sailors, they were archivists of the void. Their induction was a ritual of erasure. After passing a vetting process that scrutinized not just their loyalty, but their familial ties, their psychological need for recognition, and their capacity for solitary silence, they were brought to a secure annex at a remote base, perhaps in the fog-shrouded reaches of Washington's Puget Sound or the bleak isolation of Adak, Alaska. There, in a room without windows, an officer with no insignia on his plain uniform would deliver the only briefing they would ever receive. From this moment, you do not exist in the fleet. Your records reflect temporary duty ashore. You will receive mail through a forwarding service in Omaha. You will tell no one ever what you see or do. You were never here. You never saw this. The ship itself, when they first boarded it under cover of darkness from a nondescript tender, felt alien. It lacked the bustling, noisy vibrancy of a normal carrier. The passageways were narrower, painted in dull, non-reflective grays. The air smelled of ozone and the peculiar flat scent of advanced composites, not paint and sweat and jet fuel. There were no morale-boosting placards, no squadron logos, no "George Washington was here" graffiti. It was a machine stripped of personality, a tool for a single grim purpose. Its deployment orders never arrived via standard fleet communications. They came as encrypted data bursts, deciphered on a standalone computer in the captain's safe. The Azure platform was a needle to be threaded into the world's most sensitive haystacks. It would be dispatched to near-Arctic missile zones, loitering for weeks under the perpetual twilight or darkness, its sensors straining to catch the unique acoustic signature of a Soviet ballistic missile sub test-launching an SLBM through the ice. Its presence in those waters, if detected, would be a casus belli, so it moved with glacial patience, a phantom listening at the Kremlin's northern doorstep. It would shadow Soviet naval tests, particularly of their new terrifying Typhoon-class submarines or supersonic anti-ship missiles like the P-700 Granite, while the official U.S. Navy maintained a safe distance with destroyers and surveillance ships. The Azure platform would slip inside the Soviet perimeter, a silent, unseen witness collecting performance data from a few miles away, data that could save an entire battle group in a future conflict. Most hauntingly, it was tasked with monitoring deep ocean anomalies. The Cold War seabed was a new frontier, littered with listening posts, communication cables, and strange geological phenomena. Unidentified sonar contacts, mysterious acoustic pulses of unknown origin, were handed to the ghost carrier. It would descend upon these coordinates, lower its specialized silent submarines, and investigate. Was it a new Soviet spy drone, a lost weapon, or something else entirely? The ship was America's quiet investigator for the unexplainable deep.